Welcome to Lislab. Deep in the Ural Mountains, a wooden statue pulled from a peat bog has been dated to the very start of the Holocene, more than 11,000 years old. That age creates a contradiction. How can a hunter-gatherer world with no writing leave behind a towering sculpture packed with symbols and faces? Subscribe and share your theory in the comments, because in this documentary we are asking one central question. What does the Shigir idol really tell us about the minds and lives of the people who carved it? The Shigir idol feels like something time should have erased. Wood normally rots, but peat bogs can preserve it when oxygen is cut off and decay slows to a crawl. When the broken pieces were reassembled, they formed an anthropomorphic figure with a carved head and a long plank-like body beneath, covered in sharp geometric lines. An early reconstruction in the 1890s stood about 2.8 meters tall, but a broader reconstruction in the year 1914 suggested the original monument was about 5.3 meters. Later losses mean the surviving display is about 3.4 meters tall, and some missing sections are known only from early drawings. Today, the idol is kept in Yekaterinburg at the Sverdlovsk Regional Museum of Local Law, a surviving piece of perishable Mesolithic art that almost should not exist. The story begins in gold mining, not archaeology. In the late 19th century, miners cutting into the Shigir peat bog uncovered organic artifacts sealed in wet layers, and one find stood out. It was a broken wooden figure recovered on the 24th of January 1890 at the Second Koreansky mine, several meters below the surface. Records describe the idol appearing near wooden objects such as spoons and a paddle or oar, suggesting the bog held everyday tools as well as ritual objects. The mining owner, Count Alexei Stembok-Thermor, allowed the collection to be transferred to a local museum, where specialists began reconstructing the pieces and describing the carvings. But early publications introduced small errors about the find, year and depth, and those mistakes were repeated for decades, muddying even the basic timeline. The mining area itself has been heavily altered, and parts are no longer accessible, which means the idol context must be rebuilt from archives and scientific analysis, rather than from a clean modern excavation. When you look closely, the idol is unsettling in a quiet way. At the top is a face with eyes, a nose, and a mouth, but it is only the first. Along the body are additional faces carved into flat surfaces, stacked vertically, and careful examination in the modern era has added faces that early observers missed. When the lost fragments recorded in drawings are counted as well, researchers describe 8 faces in total, arranged like a vertical sequence. Between them, the surface is packed with zigzags, chevrons, and straight lines, dense geometry that looks less like decoration and more like deliberate communication. Then came the dates. Conventional radiocarbon tests placed the idol deep in the Mesolithic, and accelerator mass spectrometry later pushed some estimates back toward around 9,600 BC, near the start of the Holocene. Either way, it appears older than Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids by many millennia, and the question becomes not just what it meant, but how early hunter-gatherers could plan and carve a monument like this. Because the Shigir idol looks purposeful, it has become a magnet for hidden history narratives. In many popular retellings, the geometric carving is treated as a true code, like a prehistoric text cut into wood. Some claim the zigzags and chevrons are proto-writing that proves literacy existed long before the first recognized scripts in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Others reinterpret the patterning as an astronomical record, arguing that the faces mark constellations, seasons, or cosmic cycles. The most dramatic version proposes that the idol is a surviving artifact of a lost civilization at the end of the last ice age, a culture advanced enough to build monuments and preserve knowledge in symbolic form. These interpretations spread because they offer a simple solution to complexity. If the object looks sophisticated, then its creators must belong to a forgotten civilization. A quieter alternative claim focuses less on lost civilizations and more on suppression. It points out that when early radiocarbon dates first suggested exceptional age, some experts doubted them, arguing that such a large symbolic sculpture did not fit their model of Mesolithic life. From this perspective, the resistance reflected older assumptions that farming societies were inherently more advanced than hunter-gatherers, and that major ritual art should appear only after permanent villages. Supporters also note that the Urals and Siberia have often been treated as peripheral in sweeping histories, making it easier to dismiss evidence that complicates a westward story of cultural progress. In its strongest form, this argument says the real mystery is not the idol, but the history of interpretation. Who gets to define what complexity looks like and where it is allowed to appear? But skepticism does not automatically imply a cover-up, because dating wood is genuinely hard, and the idol find spot was disturbed by mining long before modern excavation standards. The mainstream investigation starts with what can be inspected directly. Detailed analysis shows the idol was carved from larch, and growth rings indicate the tree lived for roughly a century and a half before it was cut down. The trunk was split and shaped into a long plank, then carved while the wood was still fresh, suggested by the crispness of the cuts and the lack of crushed fibers typical of working dry wood. The body is covered in deep geometric engraving dominated by zigzags, and the faces are arranged as distinct images rather than a single repeated mask. Damage and compression at the base suggest the sculpture once stood upright, pressing its weight onto a hard surface before it fell and entered water. One published report has suggested that some concave details, especially facial elements, may have been carved using beaver jaw teeth as a tool, but this remains a specific hypothesis within a broader picture of skilled Stone Age woodworking. Crucially, the idol does not stand alone in the peat. The Shigir Bog has yielded thousands of waterlogged artifacts, including wooden implements and carvings, showing that woodworking and symbolic craft existed in this region, even if only rarely preserved. Dating is where the Shigir idol becomes a case study in how archaeological science evolves. Conventional radiocarbon dating in the 1990s placed the sculpture in the Mesolithic, roughly around 7,800 BC, and multiple measurements agreed closely enough to strengthen confidence in that general period. In the year 2014, a new research program documented the carvings in greater detail and designed an accelerator mass spectrometry strategy linked to the tree rings, sampling from different growth horizons rather than taking one large chunk. When those AMS results were published in the year 2018, they suggested a much earlier age near the start of the Holocene, around 9,600 BC. The researchers also noted that this period is notoriously difficult to pin down precisely because radiocarbon calibration curves flatten and shift around the transition into the Holocene. Later discussion raised practical issues as well, such as whether conservation materials applied in the museum could affect some samples, and that is one reason some teams prioritize dates from the innermost wood. Supporting context comes from the wider Shigir collection, where independently dated bone, antler, and wooden artifacts show repeated human use of these wetlands over long spans of time. Even within professional archaeology, the earliest proposed date is not accepted by everyone in exactly the same way. Some specialists point out that the wider set of AMS dates reported from different samples spans a broad range, and they argue that local paleogeography and peat formation processes in the Trans-Urals may fit better with a later Mesolithic horizon than with the very earliest Holocene estimates. Another caution raised in scholarly debate is the old wood problem. This is the possibility that a sculpture can be carved from a trunk that was already ancient when it was worked, which would make the wood older than the carving. Researchers who favor an early date respond that the cutting traces and dendrotechnical observations indicate the idol was carved from freshly felled larch rather than from a fossilized log pulled from the bog. What stands out is that this debate is about timing at the scale of millennia, not about whether the idol is genuinely prehistoric, because every serious line of evidence still places it deep in the Mesolithic. And then there is meaning, which science can approach but not solve, because zigzags and faces do not come with a key. The most careful conclusion is that the Shigir idol documents a complex symbolic world among early Holocene hunter-gatherers in the Urals, whether it embodied a myth, marked a sacred shoreline, or signaled a boundary in a landscape that mattered. So how could people so early carve such detailed symbolic art? The first answer is that our timelines are shaped by survival rather than by reality. Stone and bone dominate museums because they endure, while wood almost always disappears. The Shigir idol is rare because a peat bog sealed it in a low-oxygen environment, preserving a monument that might otherwise have vanished without leaving a trace. The second answer is that complex culture is not a product of farming alone. Complex ideas, rituals, and aesthetic conventions can thrive in mobile societies, especially where people return to meaningful places over generations. The idol does not require cities to exist, and it does not require writing to be symbolic. It requires skill, time, and a reason to communicate beyond the everyday. What it truly challenges is not the capacity of Mesolithic people, but modern expectations about what early societies should look like. What remains unresolved is the hardest part to recover from any deep past. Meaning is the missing piece. The stacked faces might represent spirits, ancestors, or a sequence in a story, and the zigzags might refer to water, boundaries, danger, or something abstract we can no longer decode. The debate over the exact date remains a live example of scientific caution, because early Holocene chronology is difficult, and different lines of evidence do not always align perfectly. Yet even with uncertainty, the Shigir idol forces a clearer vision of perspective. Monumental symbolic expression did not begin with the first farmers, and the forest-sown Ural world was not an empty margin of history. It was a place where people imagined, remembered, and carved those thoughts into wood. The Shigir idol survived because a bog hid it, but its message survived only in fragments. What do you think the faces and zigzag patterns were trying to communicate, if they were meant to be read at all? If you found this investigation valuable, like the video, subscribe to ListLab, and leave your interpretation in the comments. Welcome to ListLab. At a site more than 11,000 years old, archaeologists uncovered a life-sized human statue hidden inside a stone wall. It was not standing on display, and it was not buried beneath the ground. It had been deliberately placed inside the structure itself and sealed from view. Why would the builders of Göbekli Tepe hide a human figure inside one of the oldest ritual sites on Earth? In this investigation, we explore that question. Where exactly was the statue found? How was it positioned? Why does that placement feel so deliberate and so strange? If you enjoy balanced investigations that explore both mainstream archaeology and alternative ideas fairly, subscribe and share your view in the comments, because this is the kind of mystery that still divides opinion. The discovery came during conservation work, rather than a traditional excavation. As sections of a wall were carefully dismantled and stabilized, something unexpected appeared. A carved human figure emerged from within the structure itself. It was lying on its back, embedded horizontally at the base of the wall. The head and torso were clearly visible. The lower portion was incomplete. This was not loose debris that had slipped into place. It had been deliberately built into the wall during construction, which means someone intended it to remain there unseen. The location is what makes the find so unsettling. The statue was found within one of the monumental enclosures, positioned between the great stone pillars that dominate the site. Those pillars are usually decorated with animals and abstract symbols rather than full human forms. Yet, this figure was not placed upright, and it was not meant to be admired. Instead, it was concealed within the fabric of the building itself, almost as if it had been sealed away the moment the structure was finished. That raises an immediate question. Why hide something so deliberate in a place so important? Human imagery at Göbekli Tepe is rare and often highly stylized. Some pillars include carved arms and belts that hint at human form, but fully separate statues are uncommon. That makes this discovery unusual, not only because of what it is, but because of how it was treated. A human figure was created, positioned with care, and then hidden from sight. That combination suggests a purpose beyond decoration. It forces us to ask whether the statue was ever meant to be seen at all, or whether its meaning depended entirely on being concealed. One line of interpretation suggests deliberate concealment for symbolic or encoded meaning. In this view, the statue may represent an ancestor, a guardian, or a spiritual presence placed within the wall to protect or define the space. Some have argued that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a kind of symbolic system, where objects carried layered meanings not intended for ordinary viewing. If that is true, the hidden placement may reflect ritual knowledge reserved for only a select few. The mystery, then, is not simply what the statue is, but who was supposed to know it was there. A more speculative interpretation connects the statue to the idea of a more complex or advanced culture than traditionally accepted, because Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture and permanent settlement. Some suggest its builders possessed knowledge or organizational ability that challenges standard timelines. In that context, a concealed human figure might be seen as evidence of deeper symbolic systems, lost traditions, or beliefs we can no longer fully decode. However, these claims remain debated, and they are not supported by direct archaeological evidence. They are intriguing, but they remain possibilities rather than proof. The mainstream interpretation is more grounded in known Neolithic practices. Archaeologists suggest the statue was placed intentionally as part of a ritual act during the construction or later modification of the enclosure. Its position within the wall indicates it was inserted before the structure was completed. This fits with the idea of foundation deposits, where objects are placed within buildings as offerings, dedications, or symbolic anchors. In other words, the statue may not have been hidden by accident. It may have been hidden because that was the entire point. The broader archaeological context supports this interpretation. Göbekli Tepe is not a settlement, but a ceremonial site, with evidence pointing toward communal gathering and ritual activity. Other sites in the same region have produced human figures and carvings, suggesting that the human form already belonged to their symbolic world. The difference here is not the existence of the statue, but the decision to place it inside the architecture itself. That choice matters, because it suggests meaning attached not just to the object, but to its concealment. There are still important uncertainties. The statue is incomplete, and its original full form is unknown. It is also unclear whether it represents a specific individual, a generic human figure, or something more abstract. Researchers continue to analyze the carving style, the surrounding materials, and the exact construction sequence of the wall. For now, the strongest conclusion is simply that the placement was deliberate and meaningful. But beyond that, the deeper question remains unanswered, and that is exactly why the discovery still feels so mysterious. What makes this discovery so compelling is not just the statue itself, but the decision to hide it. A human figure was placed inside one of the earliest known monumental structures on Earth, and then sealed from view. That suggests intention far beyond decoration or display. It points toward ritual behavior shaped not only by what people saw in public, but by what they deliberately concealed in stone. Whether the statue was an offering, a guardian, a symbolic marker, or something more complex, it adds another layer to our understanding of Göbekli Tepe. It does not overturn existing interpretations, but it does make the site even harder to explain in simple terms. And that may be the real fascination of Göbekli Tepe. The more we uncover, the more it seems to hold back, leaving some of its meaning still sealed in mystery. So what do you think? Was this statue hidden to protect the structure, to represent something sacred, or to serve a ritual we still do not understand? Let me know in the comments which explanation makes the most sense to you. And if you want more balanced investigations into mysteries like this, subscribe to ListLab. Welcome to ListLab. A Viking prince said to be Ragnar's son is supposed to have sailed out of the cold north, struck Muslim Spain, passed through the gates of the Mediterranean, and reached places that would have sounded almost unreal in later Scandinavian memory. Yet the closer we move to his own lifetime, the less clearly he appears. Who was Bjorn Ironside really? Was he a real war leader, later magnified by saga? Was he attached to Ragnar only after the fact? Or does his trail through Francia and the Muslim world reveal something stranger? That Viking history becomes most famous at the exact point where fact, memory, and legend begin to merge. If you enjoy investigations like this, subscribe and tell us in the comments which version of Bjorn feels most convincing by the end. Bjorn Ironside sounds like the kind of figure history should be able to identify cleanly. He is remembered as one of the great Viking names, tied to Ragnar, to raids in Francia, and to a dramatic southern expedition into Al-Andalus and beyond that should leave a strong and unmistakable trail. Instead, when we look for him in the records closest to the 9th century, the image begins to thin out. We can see Viking fleets, we can see campaigns, we can even see a leader named Bjorn or Berno in Frankish sources, but we do not see the fully formed Viking prince later tradition seems to know so well. Bjorn feels famous before he feels secure. And that is where the mystery begins. Then Ragnar makes the problem even harder to solve. Later Scandinavian tradition presents Bjorn as one of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, part of a family line that seems to explain some of the most famous Viking raids in Europe. It is a powerful story because it turns scattered campaigns into one bloodline and gives the Viking Age a dramatic center. But the closer we get to the events themselves, the less stable that family picture becomes. The sources nearest Bjorn's supposed lifetime do not clearly present him as Ragnar's son, so now the question shifts. We are not only asking whether Bjorn existed, we are asking whether the Bjorn people think they know was constructed inside a later Ragnar tradition. Then the map widens in a way that changes the scale of the whole story. This is not only a Viking tale of England and Francia. Bjorn becomes associated with voyages into Muslim Spain, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and toward North Africa and Italy, into older and wealthier civilizations, with cities, armies, scholars, and rulers very different from the northern world. Viking audiences knew best. For later Scandinavians, that kind of journey would have felt like movement toward the edge of the known world. That is why the legend has such force. A man tied to Ragnar seems to break out of the familiar Viking map and enter a richer and stranger one. But the moment the story reaches those southern worlds, the trail begins to blur. One alternative interpretation begins with a reasonable suspicion about the survival of the evidence itself. Much of our written material for the Viking Age survives through Christian authors who were not trying to preserve the reputations of pagan war leaders, while Scandinavian memory remained oral for generations before it was written down. From that point of view, it is possible that Bjorn was clearer in northern tradition than he now appears in the surviving Latin record. Some argue that modern historians are too quick to distrust later saga material, simply because it reached parchment centuries after the events. Oral cultures can preserve real cause even when names, episodes, and motives shift over time. In that reading, Bjorn was not invented by legend. He was made harder to see by the way evidence survived. A second theory focuses on the southern expedition itself. Arabic and Andalusi sources confirm that Viking raiders entered the Muslim world, while later northern tradition remembers Bjorn as the figure who drove that expansion deeper into the Mediterranean. That overlap encourages the idea that real expeditions survived in more than one stream of memory and were only later folded into the family legend of Ragnar. Some go further and suggest that lost Scandinavian material may once have linked Bjorn to Ragnar more clearly than the surviving record does now. Others argue that Christian chroniclers preserved the shock of the raids, but not the full shape of the men behind them. None of this can be proved, but it does explain why Bjorn's legend feels less like a fantasy and more like a damaged memory that later storytellers tried to rebuild. The strongest mainstream explanation starts with the most solid part of the case. Frankish annals do appear to show a Viking leader called Berno or Bjorn operating in the same region in the later 850s, not as a saga hero, but as a real military and political actor. He appears in connection with fleets, with pressure from Charles the Bald, and with the unstable frontier politics of Viking activity in West Francia. Another near-contemporary source places a Bjorn alongside the Viking leader Sigtrygg in the Send zone and connects him to a fortified island base that Frankish rulers struggled to break. This matters because it gives the story a real historical spine. There probably was a Viking leader behind at least part of the Bjorn tradition, but the detail that seems to solve the mystery creates a bigger one. Because these early texts do not call him Ironside, do not call him Ragnar's son, and do not give him the sweeping life story later tradition insists upon. The southern world is also more historical than the legend alone might suggest. Near contemporary Frankish writing records Viking raiders making a long voyage through the straits between Spain and Africa and entering the Rhone region in the year 859 AD. Arabic and Andalusi material also confirms that Viking attacks struck Muslim Iberia, most famously in the raid on Seville in the year 844 AD, when Scandinavian raiders entered a wealthy Islamic polity and triggered a serious response. So one of the most dramatic parts of Bjorn's legend rests on something real. Viking forces truly did move into Muslim Spain and the wider Mediterranean. The edge of the known world was not imaginary. Yet that is exactly where the story becomes harder to control, because the geography is firmer than the biography. The raids are real more securely than the prince who later came to embody them. That is why historians remain careful with the fully developed Bjorn Ironside story. The explicit picture of Bjorn as Ironside and as the son of Lodbrok emerges much more clearly in later medieval writing, especially from the 11th century onward, and then expands further in Icelandic saga tradition in the 13th century. By then, writers were not simply preserving events, they were shaping memory, ancestry, prestige, and political identity into compelling narratives. The most likely result is a fusion of real elements. A real Viking leader in Francia, real southern raids into the Muslim world, inherited famous names, and a powerful genealogy centered on Ragnar were gradually woven together into one heroic life. That does not mean Bjorn was fictional in a simple sense. It means the Bjorn who survived was probably made larger, cleaner, and more dynastic than the man who first stood behind the name. So what emerges is not a clean answer, but a more revealing one. Bjorn Ironside was probably neither a complete invention nor a securely documented prince in the form later tradition presents. The most careful reading is that a real Viking leader stood behind the name, and that his memory became a vessel for much larger stories as the Viking world expanded southward. That is why Bjorn matters so much. He does not merely represent one man. He represents the point where Northern memory tried to explain how Viking raiders had suddenly broken into a far wider and more dangerous world. And that may be the deepest reason the mystery still holds. Bjorn stands at the point where Viking history enters powerful literate societies that could record the shock of northern raids, yet not in the way later Scandinavian audiences wanted. He is visible enough to feel real, but never stable enough to stay fixed. Ragnar gives him lineage, the Muslim world gives him scale, the Mediterranean gives him wonder. But the deeper we follow him into those southern worlds, the more the story stops looking like a biography and starts looking like history and epic memory woven together. Bjorn Ironside remains compelling because he seems to stand exactly where the known world widens and the man at the center begins to disappear. Do you think Bjorn Ironside was a real Viking leader, later absorbed into Ragnar's family legend, or was the legend shaping him from the beginning? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the investigation, like the video and subscribe to ListLab. Welcome to ListLab. A Viking warlord thrown into a snake pit, dying in Northumbria, while his sons swear revenge, is one of the most famous stories of the early medieval world. But when we move closest to the Viking Age itself, the trail becomes strangely uncertain. Because the records that should show Ragnar Lodbrok most clearly struggle to show him at all. So was Ragnar a real leader, later wrapped in legend, a memory made from several different men, or a powerful story invented to explain events that were already slipping into myth? In this investigation, we will follow the evidence from England and Francia to the later writers of Iceland and Denmark, separating what can be supported from what was shaped later into dramatic narrative. If you enjoy calm, evidence-based mysteries like this, subscribing, liking, and leaving a comment genuinely helps ListLab grow and tells YouTube there is an audience for careful history. And as we go, tell us which source you trust most, because Ragnar is not just a story about one man. He is also a story about how the Viking Age itself was remembered, reshaped, and made unforgettable. Ragnar Lodbrok enters history in one of the strangest ways possible, because he feels famous before he feels secure. In saga tradition, he arrives fully formed, a sea king, raider, ruler, monster slayer, husband, father, and doomed hero, as if the audience is already expected to know his name. He wins a bride by killing a serpent, and he earns the name Lodbrok through the shaggy protective trousers he wears in the fight. From there, the story expands outward into dynasty, vengeance, and fate, until Ragnar becomes the center of a family whose names echo across the Viking world. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Halfdan, and Uber are all drawn into the same orbit, as if one father could explain an entire generation of conquest. By the time most people encounter Ragnar today, he does not feel like one disputed figure among many. He feels like the Viking Age given a face. That is exactly what makes him so difficult, because the closer we get to the 9th century, the less solid that picture becomes. English chronicles record the arrival of the Viking Great Army in the autumn of 865 AD, and they describe a real and devastating military force wintering in England and tearing through fractured kingdoms. In the latest saga version, these men are Ragnar's sons, invading to avenge their father after King Alla has him cast into a snake pit in Northumbria. Yet the near-contemporary English sources do not stop to tell that story. Not even briefly. They do not explain a father, a snake pit, or a revenge oath. Instead, they show political collapse, contested kingship, the struggle for York, and ruthless campaigning, while Ragnar himself stays just beyond the edge of the frame. Even Aella, so central to the later legend, appears in the English record less like a theatrical tyrant and more like a ruler trapped in civil conflict. So the mystery deepens, because we are not only asking whether Ragnar existed, we are asking why such a vivid and specific story became dominant when the earliest witnesses are so restrained. To understand that gap, we have to ask when Ragnar truly enters the written record and what kind of record it actually is. Saxo Grammaticus wrote his Latin history of the Danes in the late 12th century, centuries after the raids Ragnar is supposed to have led, and in Saxo's hands Ragnar becomes a heroic ancestor in a grand national past. In Iceland, works like the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok and the tale of Ragnar's sons were written down later still. In the 13th or early 14th century, inside a Christian, literate culture, deeply interested in genealogy, memory, and heroic storytelling, these texts may preserve older oral material, but they also shape that material into satisfying plots, complete with motives, symbolism, and neatly arranged family lines. A poem often called Crackemore puts dramatic final words in Ragnar's mouth as he faces death. But it too belongs to a much later world than the one Ragnar is supposed to have inhabited. Earlier medieval writers outside Scandinavia sometimes attach names resembling Lodbrok to important Viking leaders, yet still stop short of giving us a securely documented Ragnar. The contrast is striking. The legend is rich, coherent, and unforgettable, while the earliest evidence is broken, partial, and frustratingly quiet. That silence has encouraged many alternative explanations, and one of the most common begins with loss and suppression. The argument is that Christian scribes controlled much of what survived in writing, and they had little reason to preserve a proud pagan founding figure in full detail unless he served their own purpose. In that view, Viking leaders usually appear in monastic and royal records when they threaten kingdoms, burn churches, or disturb Christian order, so the story we inherit is shaped by fear, politics, and moral judgment from the start. Supporters of this idea also point out that Scandinavian society relied heavily on oral tradition, meaning many stories may never have existed in stable written form or may have been lost before anyone committed them to parchment. They argue that even when Christian authors did record older traditions, they could strip away meanings that no longer fit, turning complex ancestral memory into moral drama or simplified warning. From that perspective, Ragnar's absence from the earliest record is not treated as decisive disproof. It is treated as the kind of silence history produces when one culture writes about another from the outside. That does not prove Ragnar existed, but it helps explain why the question refuses to disappear. A second alternative view argues that modern readers are sometimes too quick to dismiss the historical value of legend. Sagas may contain monsters, prophetic dreams, and impossible set pieces, but they also preserve real geography, social codes, feud structures, voyages, and remembered names that sometimes overlap with independent evidence. From this perspective, Ragnar is not a fictional invention in the modern sense, but something more difficult, a real memory blurred by repetition, performance, and time. Supporters of this position argue that the leaders of the Great Army were famous enough to attract origin stories almost immediately, and those stories may preserve the outline of a genuine founder figure even when the details expanded around him. They point to the repeated way. Later, tradition keeps connecting Ragnar to major Viking names, as though an older memory continued insisting on the relationship even after facts had begun to drift. They also note that Lodbrok sounds exactly like the kind of striking epithet that oral tradition could preserve long after dates and events had become unstable. The claim is not that every saga scene happened literally as told. It is that history often survives in distorted form, and that a real Ragnar may still stand somewhere behind the literary shadow. Mainstream historians begin from a stricter principle. A detailed biography needs support from sources close to the events, and Ragnar Lodbrok does not have that support. There is no 9th century Scandinavian life of Ragnar. no dated charter securely naming him as the saga hero, and no dated charter securely naming him as the saga hero, and no contemporary annal that presents the famous sequence of serpent slaying, snake pit death, and sons launching a revenge invasion. What survives instead are later narratives that combine heroic folklore with pieces of real history, written by medieval authors for medieval audiences who valued pattern, ancestry, and dramatic causation. The Ragnar of saga literature is built from exactly the kinds of elements that make stories endure: memorable motifs, proud speeches, violent reversals, symbolic deaths, and genealogical links that tie famous men together. Saxo's version is no neutral field report either, because he is writing a national history and shaping heroes who reflect ideals important in his own age. So the strongest official conclusion is careful rather than dismissive. The full life of Ragnar, as preserved in later tradition, is best treated first as literature and cultural memory, not as straightforward documentation from the Viking Age. That does not make it meaningless. It means the text tells us more securely about how later societies imagined the past than about what one 9th century man certainly did. Where the evidence becomes firmer is not with Ragnar himself, but with the war leaders later described as his sons. English and Irish annals record Viking figures with names matching Ivar and Halfdan during the campaigns of the Great Army, and archaeology supports the reality of large, organized Viking forces, wintering in England and operating across several kingdoms over multiple years. In that landscape, we can confirm disruption, mobility, military planning, and named commanders, even when the sources do not always agree on family ties. Excavated winter camps and burial contexts linked to Great Army activity support the scale and seriousness of the campaigns, but archaeology cannot simply point to a skeleton and announce Ragnar's bloodline with certainty. This creates a strong pressure in later storytelling, because famous leaders invite famous ancestry, and one commanding father is a powerful way to bind separate careers into one memorable narrative. Some medieval writers start supplying that missing link long before the famous sagas fully bloom. An 11th century writer like Adam of Bremen refers to a Viking called Ingvar as the son of Lodbrok, and later traditions go further, connecting Lodbrok to leaders and even symbols like the Raven Banner. In Iceland, Ari the Wise, writing in the early 12th century, used the killing of Saint Edmund as a dating point and named Ivar as the son of Ragnar Lodbrok. None of this is contemporary proof that Ragnar lived exactly as described, but it does show that the Ragnar connection was circulating in medieval memory well before later writers turned it into a complete and gripping life story. Then there is Paris, the most tempting moment of all, because here a name resembling Ragnar appears close to a securely dated event. On the 29th of March 845 AD, Vikings attacked Paris, and Frankish sources describe the assault, the defeat of Frankish resistance, and the tribute paid to persuade the raiders to leave. Some versions of the tradition name the Viking leader as Reginheris, a Latin form that may connect in some way to Ragnar, and historians have long wondered whether this raider could be one of the historical seeds later absorbed into the Lodbrok legend. But this is where the argument has to stay disciplined. The raid itself is well attested. The exact identity of the leader is less certain. The leap from Reginheris to the full saga Ragnar is possible, but still speculative. If the Paris raider really contributed to the Ragnar tradition, then another problem appears immediately, because a leader active around 845 AD cannot easily be the same man who dies decades later in the fully developed Northumbrian revenge story, at least not without stretching chronology beyond comfort. That is why many mainstream historians see Ragnar as a composite figure, created when different leaders, raids, memories, and regional traditions gradually fused into one heroic biography. Another possibility is that several men named Ragnar existed, and later storytellers merged them, attaching Lodbrok to the version that best served the legend. In either case, Paris shows how a real and dramatic event could be drawn into the making of myth. But it still stops short of giving us one fully documented Ragnar Lodbrok. After following the sources, Ragnar Lodbrok does not disappear, but he refuses to stand still. The texts that give him a complete life are late, literary, and shaped by authors who wanted the past to feel coherent, meaningful, and dramatically satisfying. Yet the legend did not emerge from nowhere, because the Viking Great Army and the leaders associated with it are historically visible, and their campaigns transformed England and echoed across Europe. Ragnar offers something history often does not: a clean line of cause and effect, one father, one death, one vengeance, one reason the storm broke. Real history is rarely that tidy, which is exactly why the story endured. It gave later generations a way to remember violence, leadership, dynasty, and identity in a form they could pass on. Even if Ragnar is composite, the legend still contains truth of a different kind. The mystery is not only who Ragnar was, but why medieval Europe needed him to be there. So was Ragnar real, or was he Viking legend? The most careful answer is that we cannot confirm a 9th century Ragnar Lodbrok in the full saga sense. And the safest conclusion is that the figure was shaped from several strands of memory rather than preserved intact from one life. Yet the persistence of the connection, appearing across different regions and kinds of medieval writing before the great saga texts were written down, suggests that the tradition itself was already old by the 11th and 12th centuries. Perhaps there was a feared raider whose name resembled Ragnar. Perhaps there were several. Perhaps Lodbrok began as a separate label that later fused with a remembered dynasty of war leaders. What remains unresolved is whether one man truly stands behind the legend, or whether the legend is what happens when many real lives are folded into one unforgettable ancestor. And that uncertainty may be the most revealing part of all, because it shows how oral memory, political storytelling, and written history can weave together until the join disappears. Ragnar may fade when we try to pin him down as a single man, but his survival tells us something larger: how the Viking Age became a story the medieval world could not stop retelling. Ragnar Lodbrok may be less a man we can prove and more a mirror reflecting what later generations wanted the Viking Age to mean. So, what do you think is more likely? A real Ragnar remembered imperfectly, or a legend built from many lives and shaped into one heroic past? If you enjoyed this investigation, please like the video, subscribe to ListLab, and leave your view in the comments, because those simple actions really do help the channel grow and help more people find careful history without the noise.